If we're not careful, the NDIS is going to destroy us all. Sounds like a big claim. I'm not someone who's prone to exaggeration, but I believe that that is absolutely true, and I'm about to explain why. My name's Topher Field, this is the Topher Project, and I'm here to help you understand the world as we head into the year 2025. If you've seen my earlier programs, you'll know I'm actually pretty optimistic. I'm pretty excited about this year. I think it's going to be a really, really good one. But Australia has a problem. And that problem is the NDIS. And no, I'm not just talking about the fraud, although that is a pretty big problem. We've just uncovered even more of it. Millions upon millions of dollars in wasted taxpayer money on fraudulent claims from the assistants and the people helping, and also fraudulent claims from the disabled people that are being helped. But actually, the fraud isn't what makes the NDIS so dangerous to Australia. The NDIS is dangerous to us because it exists. Its very existence is an existential threat to Australia. The NDIS is not only hurting the disabled people that it claims to be helping, yes, I'll back that up in a minute, but it is also stealing from the future. And it has the potential to accomplish what the Cloward Piven Strategy could not, and bring about a collapse of capitalism. I'll explain it all right now. I want to draw some boundaries around this conversation because I'm going to say some pretty provocative things that are going to piss off a lot of people. Now, of course, you're free to disagree with me. Jump in the comments, tell me why I'm wrong. I'll be in there too. Let's have a chat about it. But I want to draw some boundaries around this first because every single time I say something controversial, I get accused of saying things that I haven't said. So let's put some parameters in place. Firstly, we have to accept, whether we like it or not, that the wealth of a given country, of a given civilization, the wealth of the planet at any given moment in time is simply the outcome of a simple equation: productivity minus consumption over time. If we produce more than we consume, then over time we get richer. We have houses and cars and technologies and medical technologies and leisure time, and we can do things that we couldn't do back when we weren't able to produce excess, when we weren't able to produce more than we needed to consume. But if we consume over time more than we're producing, then we become poorer over time. So quite literally, an entire civilization's wealth can be explained by that equation: production minus consumption over time. It's as simple as that. Your own personal financial situation can be described the same way. How much are you able to generate, to produce, versus how much you choose or need to consume? If you can generate a surplus, then you're able to save money, you're able to invest, you're able to use that money to then generate an even bigger surplus, and that's how the rich get richer. But if you're just struggling to get by, if what you produce isn't really worth all that much, perhaps you don't have a lot of skills, or perhaps where you live there's not a lot of opportunity, or perhaps your life circumstances are really difficult. You might be someone who is disabled, and it's really difficult for you, genuinely difficult for you to produce. In that situation, you might find yourself producing less than what you need to consume, in which case poverty lies ahead. Now, we'll talk about individuals who are disabled in a moment, but we need to just first accept that this is true. This is reality. It is not heartless to point that out. If we allow people to consume more than they produce, then they are taking from other people. Now, I believe that that's okay in the case of disabilities. We'll get to that. But we just have to accept that that's the truth. If you are producing less than you need to consume, then you are relying on other people producing more than they need to consume. Otherwise, there's no excess. There's nothing for you to live from. So production matters. And specifically, as a civilization, producing more than we consume matters. In fact, the only reason we have the quality of life that we have today is because past generations produced more than they consumed. We were born and there was all this incredible infrastructure, all this incredible knowledge and technology and education, all this amazing stuff that we just got born and there it was. Why was it there? Well, because past generations created more than they consumed. So we benefit from this. And actually, if you think about it, provocative statement number one: there has never been a better time or place in history to be poor or to be disabled than right here and right now. Sorry about that, but it's true. I'm not making light of your situation. But would you choose to swap with a poor disabled person in, let's say, Rome during the Roman Empire? Or how about, I don't know, during the Second World War? Would you really want to swap with anyone else at any other time or any other place in history with the same set of circumstances as what you have right now? The wealth of our ancestors, the production, what they created and then left for us, has given us the greatest quality of life of any generation in history, notwithstanding that the last couple of years have been a little bit wonky, I'll admit. you'll notice that politically speaking, the left, by which I mean, the Greens and the communists, but I repeat myself, they focus on inequality. That's the metric they use. Oh, inequality is getting worse. The reason they focus on inequality is because if they actually focused on fundamental quality of life, they would have to admit that there has never been a better time to be poor or a better place to be poor than right here and right now in Australia. They focus on inequality to try and make you jealous of the person that's got more than you, but they completely ignore the fact that even a poor person in Australia is among the top 5% of the wealthiest people that have ever lived. And a median wage earner in Australia is in the top 1% globally for wealth. It's mind-boggling to think about that. But would you want to swap and be a poor person in some part of Africa or Asia or South America or Siberia? No, of course you wouldn't. You'd much rather be a poor person here. And that's because of the wealth that was created by our ancestors, because they created more than they consumed. All right, so consuming more than we create requires us to take value from others. But that's actually what we're doing right now, and I can demonstrate this. When I was born in the early 1980s, we had mostly infrastructure that worked, and we had relatively speaking compared to now, we had relatively little debt. Then, of course, along came John Howard, the Prime Minister, and paid off the debt. Federally speaking, we were debt-free. All of the infrastructure that we had, all of the incredible civilization that we had built, we owed no money on. Fast forward 20 years later, and we are loaded with debt, and our infrastructure is worse than it was 20 years ago. Where did that money go? Well, we've been spending it on consumption. We haven't actually been spending our money on real things that have lasting value. We've been spending it on consumption. And right now, we're actually stealing from our children. We are spending money that we don't have to consume things in the here and now, and then our children are going to get left with the debt. When you live beyond your means, when you consume more than you create, which is what we as a civilization have been doing now for 20 years, someone else has to foot that bill. And right now we are stealing from our future generations. In the same way that our ancestors left us with infrastructure and minimal debt, we are leaving our children crumbling infrastructure and terrible debt. And that, to me, is a crime. If we impoverish this country, if we continue down the road that we're on, consuming more than we create, then the people that will suffer the most are the poor and the disabled. I saw this with my own eyes when I was in Venezuela in 2015. This is a country that, like Australia, was once amongst the wealthiest in the world. Venezuela has everything. Wonderful growing environment to be able to grow incredible tropical fruits and wonderful natural bounty. They have the world's largest proven oil reserves. They have gemstones by the squillions in their mountains. An incredible opportunity for tourism. What a phenomenally beautiful part of the world, centrally located between multiple different continents, accessible to Europe, North America, and to the wealthy of South America. They could have it all. But they're among the poorest countries on earth. They instituted socialism, instituted communism effectively under the name of socialism, and they impoverished their country because they stopped people from producing. And pretty quickly they consumed all of what was available to them, and they headed into decline. They headed into poverty. Now, I saw with my own eyes the way that poor people in Venezuela have to live, and it's really jarring because you look around and you look at the architecture and you look at the history and you say, well, this actually feels like the Paris end of Collins Street in Melbourne. Beautiful old, colonial era buildings, these old banks and these old beautiful buildings. That place had money. And then you lower your eyes and you don't just see a person sleeping rough the way that you do in Melbourne or in Sydney. You see lines of people wearing rags, living in abject poverty, lined up to hopefully get into a supermarket in the hope that they might be able to get some bread. That maybe today they'll be lucky and get that butter that they've been trying to get for the last couple of weeks. It's incredibly jarring. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. That's what happens when you consume the wealth of your own country. When you stop production, reduce production, and either maintain or increase consumption, very quickly you start running out of things. And the people that will suffer the most if we do that in Australia are the disabled. They are the poor. Those people are the ones that will bear the brunt of this if we keep going the way that we are. Okay, so those are the first two boundaries. The first one is we have to produce more than we consume. The second one is if we fail to do that, it is the poor and the disabled that will suffer the most. Another boundary. No one should be abandoned. People are going to watch this video and accuse me of being heartless about people who are disabled and people who are poor. That is not true. The third boundary that I'm drawing around this conversation for us to have is that no one should be abandoned. No one should die of hunger, of bad water, of a lack of shelter, of a lack of clothing, or even a lack of basic emergency medical care. Now, I'm a Christian. I try to base as much as I can. Every human being's flawed. Trust me, I am too. But as much as I can, I try and base what I believe on what I see in the Bible. The Bible is very, very clear. Do not ignore the cry of the poor. If a poor person is asking you for help, do not ignore their cry. Do not simply turn your back and walk away. Also, the parable of the Good Samaritan that Jesus told talks about a man providing medical care and accommodation to someone who was a victim of crime. Now, that wasn't a disability, that wasn't poverty in that sense, but it's someone who's a victim of crime. So we see in Scripture, you support the disabled. You do not turn your ear, do not turn away from the cry of the poor, and you be there to help get people back on their feet when they get knocked down by crime or even by natural disaster and droughts and so forth. There's a plethora of examples throughout the Bible. We should be actively engaged in charity, and no one should be abandoned. That's the third boundary on this, and I mean that. Don't go into the comments accusing me of not caring. I just want to find a better way that is not an existential threat for this country. Okay, so those are the three boundaries. We must produce as a civilization more than we consume. If we don't, it is the disabled and the poor that will suffer the most. The very people that the NDIS claims to be helping will suffer the most if we fail to accomplish number one, producing more than we consume. And number three, no one should be abandoned. Charity should be there to help lift people back up. And even for your entire lifetime, if you're someone who's been unfortunately born with a disability and it's just not feasible for you to produce more than you consume, then yes, you should be supported for your entire lifetime so that you are not abandoned. That is boundary number three on this conversation. Okay, with the boundaries in place, let's get down to the meat of it. The NDIS, as it is currently designed, destroys productivity en masse at a scale that this country has never seen before. And if it is left unchecked, it will ultimately impoverish this country and hurt the very disabled and poor that it is meant to be helping right now. The way it does it is this. It does it in three, there's three layers of the destruction of productivity that the NDIS has. The first is that it actively discourages disabled people from doing as much as they can. What you would hope to see, given that we all need to be producing as much as we reasonably can, what you would hope to see is that someone who's born with a disability will do what they can, and then we charitably as a community come in and provide them what they need, whatever the shortfall is for what they need. But we should be encouraging them to do what they can. The NDIS and the way that it's structured is when people get involved with the NDIS system, they want to make themselves as vulnerable as possible. They want to claim as much as possible. That's the incentive when someone moves into the NDIS system. So we're actively discouraging them from doing what they can do and in fact punishing them. If you start to earn good money or these sorts of things, you can start to be punished by the system for the crime of being productive, for the crime of doing what you can do. Now, I'm not suggesting that every disabled person is rorting the system or that every disabled person is faking it or anything like that. Don't jump in the comments and accuse me of saying things I haven't said. What I'm saying is that the incentive is there for people to say, I could do that, but you know what? It doesn't serve my interest. It's the system wants me to claim as much as I possibly can, and so I will. That incentive is there. And if you show me the incentives, I can show you the outcome. Humans respond to incentives. The second layer, so that's the first layer of the destruction of productivity, is it actually incentivizes people who are disabled to reduce their productivity to the lowest level they can get away with, instead of trying to produce as much as they reasonably can. The second level is that the helpers that are being brought in and paid for by the NDIS system, they are people who could be out in the marketplace doing other productive work that's building civilization, but now they're being paid ridiculously good money. And I know if you work through an agency, you might not be getting good money, but the taxpayer is paying a lot of money for you and for your agency that's taking a huge proportion of that money. There's an enormous amount of money per hour being spent on those helpers to do work that actually, from a civilizational perspective, is not it's not productive. It's not wealth that's going to be passed to our children. It's not building a surplus that we can pass on as an inheritance to future generations. It is consumption in the here and now. Now, again, I'm not saying we should abandon disabled people. Don't jump in the comments and tell me I've said things I haven't said. But we have to recognize that these are people who, and I know people personally, who have left jobs in the private sector because they could make so much more money going and being a shopping assistant for people, or going and sitting in people's homes just in case they have an accident or some kind of a medical emergency. They're going from productive work into unproductive work and being paid more for it. That's robbing from our children. That is stealing from future generations. But that's only the second layer of the destruction of productivity. The third layer is that they're being paid with money that was earned by productive people that actually did something that the market wanted. Other people paid their money in return for their goods or in return for their services. They were productive. Now that money's being taken from them, whether they like it or not. They would have spent that on something productive. They would have turned around and said, I've earned this money. I'm going to spend it on something that I want, that I need, that makes my life better. They might have invested it, or they might have just consumed it in some cases. Sure, plenty of, we all need to consume as a matter of living, as a matter of eating and having clothes and all the rest of it. But they would have put that money to work in the productive private sector. So now that's the third layer of wealth destruction, of productivity destruction. The money is coming from productive people and being taken away from productive uses. It's being spent on people who could have done productive work elsewhere and are now doing less productive or even unproductive work in the NDIS. And we know there's an enormous amount of people just slacking off, sitting on their asses, taking advantage of the very, very good wicket they find themselves on. But even the ones that do work hard, because there are plenty of those too, is it really productive to have an adult human being be a shopping assistant when you can get your groceries delivered these days? Is it really productive to have a lot of this sort of companionship work? Like, I get it. Loneliness is a thing. Loneliness is a problem. We as a community should be helping people to tackle that. But should we be putting people on these rolled gold financial packages, getting paid stupid amounts of money every hour to fix that problem? I don't think so, especially not when those people could and should have a job in the productive private sector that is building wealth towards the future. And finally, the third layer, or the first layer as I went through it originally, is that the disabled person themselves is not incentivized to be as productive as they can be. The NDIS is eating our productive capacity alive, and it is doing it at a scale that this country has never seen before. See, the problem here is that Australians have never seen what it looks like to live in poverty. All my life, born in the early 80s, we've had it good. We sailed through the global financial crisis. We sailed through the Asian financial crisis. We haven't really been touched by war. Our resources sector has carried us through every single downturn, and we think we're immune. We think that we can do the things that have impoverished other nations, but we'll get away with it because somehow we're special. Well, that's a lie, and it's going to bite us in the ass, and it's going to hurt the poor and the disabled more than anybody else. So what do we do about it? Well, actually, firstly, before we talk about what we're going to do about it, let's talk about how bad this could get. In the 50s and 60s and 70s, you had the radicals, the revolutionaries, the communists trying to take over the Western world. They genuinely believed that they wanted to bring about a communist revolution in America, Australia, the UK, etc. And there are people out there that still do. One of the people, or two people, a couple, that were part of the thought leadership of that era were Cloward Piven, and they developed a strategy called the Cloward Piven Strategy. They were a couple, and they wrote this book together. And essentially, I can explain the whole thing to you in basically a sentence. To collapse a country by making it spend too much money on welfare. Use the welfare system to collapse a capitalist, democratic country, and then use that collapse as the pretext to bring in communism. That was literally their strategy, the Cloward Piven Strategy. You can look it up, you can read their book. Now, Cloward and Piven are long dead, and no, I don't think there's Reds under the bed and there's Marxists sitting there trying to take over Australia and turn it into a communist country. But I would say that if you wanted to collapse our economy by overextending the welfare system, the NDIS is a pretty good way to go about it. And the problem is that we've sleepwalked into this. I don't think anyone was sitting there going, I can destroy the Australian economy. I don't think that's what was happening at all. I think people sat there with good intentions and said, well, what else can we do to help the disabled? What else can we do to help the poor? And because of this delusion that we're not going to end up in poverty, Australia's not going to end up like Venezuela. Don't be ridiculous. I came back from Venezuela in 2015 and I warned, I said, listen, we're heading in that direction. If we keep going for too much longer, we will end up in the same place. We're not special. We can't magically avoid that fate. And people laughed at me. Well, fewer people are laughing at me now. Still plenty are, but fewer. Because more and more people are beginning to go, oh, hold on. We are actually going in that direction. And unless we change direction, we will end up where they are. And that would be a terrible, terrible thing for the disabled and for the poor in Australia. I don't want to see that happen. What I would like to see happen is that our productivity picks back up again, enough to more than cover our consumption, so that we are creating surplus value every single year, and that this country just gets wealthier and wealthier, and the quality of living of our poor and our disabled continues to improve and improve, because they live in a place that is continuing to become the best place in the world to be poor, the best place in the world to be disabled. How do we get there? Well, first things first, we have to stop the rort. We have to stop the boondoggle. We have to stop the NDIS from eating our productivity, because that only leads in one direction. That only goes in one direction. What we need actually is a rebirth of civic institutions, of mutual support. And we need the government to stop destroying our lives through excess cost of living. One of the things that often parents will say to me is, well, I have a disabled child. I couldn't possibly look after that disabled child if it weren't for the NDIS. And I say to them, well, could you look after that disabled child if it weren't for taxes? And they'll say, well, yeah, probably. So it's the cost of government that has put you in a position where you can't afford to properly look after your disabled child. And if the cost of government were taken care of, if that was cut down to size, then actually you wouldn't need the government handouts. And this is a perfect example of that old expression. The government, I think it was Harry Brown, said, the government breaks your legs. That's the cost of living and not being able to afford to look after your own family. The government breaks your legs and then they hand you a crutch. That would be the NDIS in this example. And then the government says, see, if it weren't for us, you wouldn't have been able to walk. That's exactly what's happening right now. Why are people struggling? Why are poor people as poor as they are in this country? Why is it so difficult for a disabled person to get by, for a family with a disabled family member to be able to make all of that work financially? Why is that so hard? It's the cost of government. They're the ones that broke your legs. The NDIS is the crutch. And when I say, hey, listen, guys, if the government didn't break your legs, you wouldn't need the crutch, people get mad at me. They say, no, we want our crutch. Don't you dare touch my crutches. Well, how about we deal with the problem at the source? How about we take a leaf out of Argentina's book and cut the government down to size, the cost of living and the cost of government, so your taxes drop, your cost of living drops, the cost of energy drops, the cost of petrol in your car drops, the cost of food drops. Let's abolish a lot of this regulatory nonsense that drives up the price and the cost of just staying alive. And let's make it easier for the poor, for the disabled, for the families of the disabled, to be able to make their own way in the world without having to depend on a crutch. NDIS. I personally wouldn't wish having to live with a massive bureaucracy in my life 24/7 on anyone. I wouldn't wish Centrelink dependency on anyone, and I certainly wouldn't wish NDIS dependency on anyone. Can you imagine? I mean, some of you don't. Some of you live with it every single day. The incompetence, the paperwork, the waste, the nonsense. How about we do away with all of that? But it has to start by cutting the government down to size, cutting our taxes down to size, and through the destruction of regulation, cutting our cost of living down to size, so that families can get by without the need for the NDIS. They can make their own way in the world. What I know for sure is that we can't keep going the way we are. It might sound heartless, but the NDIS cannot be allowed to continue as it is. It is destroying this country. And that is a very, very serious thing. And for someone who has seen what it looked like in Venezuela, I know what our future looks like if those with good intentions get their way. Because the NDIS is a gold-plated yellow brick road to hell, paved with good intentions. My name's Topher Field. Thanks for watching.